Congratulations on making it until 3 p.m. on Friday, especially if you participated in the events last night and anything just pre-conference. So you have no idea how grateful I am that you came to this talk because it's 3 p.m. on a Friday. So thank you for coming. I hope to make it worth your while. And all right. Well, I will seek to meet them. So my name is Rob Mixer. I work for Proofpoint full-time. I'm based here in Austin. This is not a Proofpoint talk, though. I'm going to talk more generically about the topic. So I hope you all got a chance to read the really funny CAPTCHA humor for AI. To one of the points earlier, someone was asking what are some of the limitations of AI. I think this is one of them. Okay, so AI supply chain security, a topic that is probably front of mind for every one of us over the weekend and during the week, right? Who actually thinks about AI supply chain security? No hands? Oh, a couple? Okay. I do because of my role, and so I thought I'd share some of my thoughts on it. So I'm based here in Austin, as I said. I've been doing product security or application security now for close to 30 years. I've been married to my wife for just about that long as well, a college sweetheart. 4 kids, almost all grown and out of the house at this point, although some at various stages have grown, let me put it that way, as the case may be. And one of the things that I love to do is to help enable other people to do some of the things that I've done in the past. That's kind of the stage of life. And I hope all of you if you didn't catch that from the mentoring kind of pushes earlier in the conference, I hope you take that with you. It is very worthwhile to bring other folks along and enable them to do what you do and even better, right? I'm regularly surprised by folks that I work with that catch a concept and take it way farther in security than I've ever done. Well worth it. I just want to tee this up. Why this talk? Because it is not the sexy topic, right? It really isn't. My main goal here is to help each one of us and anybody who's watching in the video later learn about a class of attacks to the point that it becomes secondhand nature to you. That's my goal. I find in life, seeing something once, it doesn't stick. Seeing it 10 times, it doesn't stick. Sometimes it's hundreds of times before this thing becomes so innate that intuitively I can look at a description of a product and think, I wonder if they've got this, right? Or I see a storage thing here, let me dive into that. It smells, right? Just the very nature that there's this storage mechanism in the system. So that's my goal. It's a very classic type of attack, so don't be put off by that. Think of this in terms of, if I want to master this class of attack, here's a way to go about it, and I hope that this will help you along your journey. Okay, so you all know what this is in the upper right corner. I probably don't even have to put it anywhere in the title. Everyone recognizes the Trojan horse, right? What I want to do is take some time to look backwards. You might call it invent backwards. I know that's an awkward term, but we're going to look backwards in history to learn about this whole class of attacks that predates any one of us. See what we can glean from that, apply that to some current real-world scenarios in AI supply chains, okay? So bear with me if you're very familiar. It turns out that Odysseus, who's the famous Trojan horse strategist, 12 centuries BC, was not the first. I had no idea until I delved into this topic. He studied an Egyptian strategist who lived 250 years before him. That Egyptian general named Jehuti pulled off a very similar ruse using baskets, and every basket had one soldier inside it. And that Egyptian general paid it as tribute to his enemy, then out popped the soldiers, and he won that particular battle, and it ended up turning the tide of that particular war. Fascinating story, right? We all give credit to Odysseus for pulling off this ruse. He's the most famous, as all of us know. But he wasn't the first, and I bet you if there were accurate records going farther back, there are other examples of this too. So what can we glean as common patterns out of this type of attack? Think with me through this, because I bet you top of mind you would hit most of these. There's some kind of offer of value. Maybe it's a gift. Maybe it's something that appeals to a person's pride, right? Like, wow, I'm going to have this trophy horse. A gift of a tribute that appeals to somebody's pride as well. You know, yeah, my enemy finally is coming around to see that I am this great person that I know I am, and that they haven't believed to this date. But there's always something of value, and it appeals to the person that is the recipient. Second, it's accessible. I use that word very carefully here because in both of these cases, the thing given was a gift, but it wasn't something that the recipient had to go out and try to find and get, right? It was actually like brought or made very, very accessible to them right at their front door. The goal in all these cases, it was a ruse, right? Somehow to trick the recipient into thinking, you know, to bring this thing inside the gate in order to actually get exploited, which is the next item. But the idea here is, you think about it, if that horse picture that we were looking at earlier, if it looked like some, I don't know, shack with cardboard and staples and some sheet metal kind of all fitted together, the person's guard would be up, right? Like this something's weird about this. Not only has the value kind of proposition come down, but the person also is like more likely to be suspect. The more shiny, glossy, professional looking, the better. In fact, if it even has official names and a wiki and some branding, right? All these, I'm going fast forward here, but those kinds of things make the ruse seem real. And the more of those that you have, the more likely it is that the person will let down their guard. You know it has a hidden exploit. In this case, these were military type of exploits. But you all know there are a bunch of different type of exploits that can happen with software Trojan horses. And then finally, there's the trigger. There's the less or the fewer things that a person has to do in order for the trigger to happen, the better. You can imagine if there were all these locks and other barriers around the baskets that I talked about or on the Trojan horse itself, the ruse would have been a little less effective because it may not have triggered for several days. And now you've got soldiers inside at risk of passing out, fatigue, whatever, right? It has to be a pretty quick trigger. These, I would say, these may not be comprehensive, but at least they seem to be the hallmarks of a classic Trojan horse type of ruse. Okay. Let's take that learning on this class of attacks and apply it going forward. So, adversary opportunities with AI. The same set of criteria here. Think with me for a second about the plight of an engineer on a development team that's told, I want to apply artificial intelligence to this problem. They have to find the right library. They certainly don't want to go out and have to train up a model from scratch or the tools to generate the vector databases, et cetera, et cetera. They want to go and find, has somebody already solved this problem? It's a classic setup for a high value type of proposition to somebody to save all that time. The more professional it looks in terms of performance metrics, effectiveness metrics against benchmarks and so forth, the better. It appears to be legitimate. And it actually may be legitimate, but somebody's compromised it behind the scenes. So it fits all the criteria for value, both from the giver as well as from the receiver's perspective. It has to be accessible. Nobody's going to download a model if they don't know where it is, right? If it's if it's not just front and center. And Hugging Face, for example, is a very common place for all kinds of data scientists and engineers to go to find these kind of models. It's an online software repo. You might think of it like kind of like a GitHub. If you're not familiar, GitHub for source code that's open source, Hugging Face for models that are open source, as well as, and not just generative AI models. There are a bunch of different models, classifiers. There are also some of these libraries for working, like converting data sets into vectors and so forth. So there's the accessibility, searchable. You can look for the metrics, professional, and so forth. But let's go on to the goal. So the goal would be, if you were an attacker, either post your own compromised model or compromise one in their storage system with the hopes that when this person uses the model, your exploit runs. And we'll see exactly how to pull some of those attacks off in just a minute. And then finally, the trigger. If you remember, the criteria here is the fewer steps a person has to do, the better. So you've got find and download, 2 steps. You've got load, and then you've got send prompts to it if we're talking about a generative AI model. You know the person has to do find. You know the person has to do download. Can we actually get our code to trigger at load time, even if the person never sends a prompt? And the answer is yes. It is actually quite possible. Let's talk about Python and pickling. I put this slide in here because I realize in a room like this, or even folks watching it later, may not be familiar with either of these with respect to data science and ML. And let me be clear, I didn't do this up front. When I use the term AI, I'm using it in the Stanford University sense. They published this really short paper of definitions and said AI, in their mind, is this overarching general term that includes generative AI, but it also includes more classic, like machine learning type of models as well. Machine learning would be a much more niche kind of case. Generative AI, another niche case, but all under this umbrella. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about AI. All right, so Python has been used heavily by data scientists for years, right? That's not new on the scene. There are so many Pandas is one of the most common libraries for ingesting a data set, manipulating it, cleaning up your data, running statistical analysis on it if you bring in NumPy. Talk to any data scientist, they know Python, which is kind of cool if you're a security practitioner, because guess what tool we use most of the time for our own scripting is Python, right? Some of the common libraries are PyTorch. Another one I've listed here is TensorFlow. Pandas I'd already mentioned. These are just very common. Talk to your data scientists, they know what these things are and they use them. So what's up with pickling then? Pickling is a serialization, deserialization library within Python, or within the Python ecosystem. And I realize this is very basic, so for those of you who already know this stuff, bear with me for a second just so that I can kind of level set everyone in the room. The problem, even in the documentation for pickling, they put the warning, don't unpickle untrusted data. Make sure that if you pickle it, so you take an object from Python, write it to a serialized format, say to store it in disk, make sure that you know that what you're going to deserialize later is still that same data you expect. So the opportunity, though, is it's a classic OWASP top 10 issue, unsafe deserialization. If that storage format is altered in any way, with untrusted content now, when you deserialize that content into memory, there are ways to trigger code to execute. In fact, there are even helper libraries in Python, believe it or not, where you could just, in a string, put your Python code and it will help you get it into a pickled format that can execute. So if I string these things together, picture in your mind, I download a model from a repo like Hugging Face, I load it, and behind the scenes, RCE is happening, running the attacker's code on my developer laptop. Where I have other data, especially if I'm a data scientist, I have other access at least to sensitive data. That's the scenario that plays out with pickling. This came to light a couple years ago, so this is not brand new on the scenes when it comes to generative AI. I actually want to show you, and I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but Hugging Face, since this came to light, has actually added a pickling scan of all of the repos that they host, and they will put front and center on a model if their pickling scan found unsafe pickling. Not that it had malware, but just that model is susceptible to this type of attack, really is what this warning says. So I put it here, detected pickle imports 4. That's a warning tag. For us security people, we probably would see that and say, okay, I need to figure out what this is. For developers, not so. You think about the developer's mindset. Fast, I need to get this working. They won't necessarily look at this detail. They'll find somebody that says, import this thing in your Python project and say go. And behind the scenes, it goes and grabs it from Hugging Face. They never see this UI, just for awareness. So it's really important that we think about the developer workflow when we're thinking about how to protect against this. And more on that later. There also is a malware scan. So I didn't want to totally gloss over that. I'll just mention it briefly. The same way that Hugging Face highlights unsafe pickling, they actually will also highlight if they detect malware so that you're aware. But all that's just in the UI. Okay, let me talk TensorFlow. Because pickling has been it has been the subject of a lot of talks. This one isn't the first by far. I've benefited from others. TensorFlow is another library that's used in machine learning. It can't run, like I put here, it can't run the Python code directly from a saved model, so that's good. Generally safe. However, there are 2 opportunities to use TensorFlow unsafely that I wanted to point out here. And if you think about these 2 cases, these are going to be ones that your developers might think are safe and are worthy of say, scanning code specifically, like through regex or so forth, looking for these kind of patterns. So TensorFlow, the Keras Lambda layers, it uses the built-in Python unmarshal, which is very similar to pickling. Pickling is an add-on library to Python, but unmarshal for JSON is just built right into the core language of Python. It also is unsafe. Warnings abound in the Python language about using it, but TensorFlow Keras Lambda layers use it. And I put a definition here just so that you know what a lambda layer is. It allows arbitrary expressions to be used as a layer in the model when you're constructing functions, right? And this would execute specifically in what they call graph mode. So I mentioned that because that one case is really important in order for this to be able to be possible and to run, but it will trigger on load, just like the pickling I mentioned earlier. And then the second case is the one I mentioned on the right. This is where TensorFlow in that graph execution mode allows some of this file I/O to happen. So between the model and the underlying host, you can regex search for files, you can read files, write files, and that executes every time that layer in the model runs. So as somebody prompts, it runs through the model, more files can be grabbed, more files can be overwritten. It's supposed to be for developer kind of workflows, but it works in production as well. And you can imagine the kind of scenarios that can happen if I'm able to smuggle code in that can overwrite files, or find and overwrite files on the file system with the same privilege that the model's running at. Oh, I forgot to mention, because this one executes as the model is processing the input parameters, it actually can do different behaviors based on the parameters it's being fed. So you can have very dynamic type of don't trigger on this, don't trigger on this. Only when you see this keyword that I send, at the appropriate time to this prompt, do I want you to take the action? So it can even be much more hidden type of exploit. Okay, so the kinds of things that are possible. Remote code execution we already mentioned. Web shells are very lightweight and easy to embed in a model like this. Obviously, since you can do file I/O, you can read data out of the file system. You can also do a very, very rudimentary wiper that just deletes stuff off the file system. And then for the graph execution mode kind of case, you can actually alter the model output for specific inputs, which is fascinating that you can do this all in code embedded within a model that normally just is crunching numbers in order to predict output. So a very interesting couple of cases that are helpful to be aware of. So let's evaluate the opportunity. I already, instead of doing this as a build, I just went ahead and put all the green check marks in here. But it meets all the criteria of a classic high value, high payout type of a Trojan horse attack. The most important aspect to me, besides the accessibility and the hidden nature of it, is the trigger. Since the two of the three exploits I talked about occur on load, think about the different environments that can get compromised. I, as the data scientist or engineer who's working with the model on my local machine, during CI, any tests that are run against the model on test input, those systems are going to fire that same code. And if this escapes all the way to production, it's happening there as well. So as an attacker, I get visibility all the way through somebody's supply chain. If I'm smart, I just do an initial kind of dropper, if you will, that lets me inject additional modules once I figure out where my code is running and if I'm interested in follow-on actions on that objective. It's quite a powerful type of deal. Okay. That's the main vein of this talk, and what I want to do is highlight something. So I learned a lot of that from Hidden Layer, so kudos to them. I want to highlight what I've learned from Google. This paper came out in April of this year, and I think it's important for all of us to be aware of what Google's thoughts are on the supply chain kind of aspect, because I've only touched on the model-related stuff. In this paper, Google goes into more detail with a more comprehensive threat model, way beyond Trojan horses. And I want to just highlight a few things, but this is worth a read. If you're already familiar with SALSA, the software supply chain security paper that they published shortly after the SolarWinds attacks, you can skip the first half of this paper and jump to the second half where they talk about the data science and ML kind of workflows. But this is one of the two threat models they show in there. I think this one is a little clearer. And I'm going to highlight a few pieces of this as we go. But just to orient you to it, the main workflow is this one right across the middle. Take data sets, train the model, deploy to some place, either in-house or external hub, push to production, and then actually do inference, right? Like runtime kind of stuff with your model. What I've highlighted so far, I've kind of hidden the other, was just this one piece, right? Poisoning the model. Whether it's the developer that poisons it in storage, or an attacker gets into storage in Hugging Face and corrupts it, that's just C. The other places to point you to are the actual model source and ML framework in the upper left corner. There are known CVEs in PyTorch and the tools that are used to actually do the ML work. And that's a ripe opportunity, not just for those tools to inject code if they're corrupt, but also for developers to make mistakes. So there are, or worse, do something malicious. So there are opportunities up there at the model source. There are opportunities in-house let's say you store the model in some artifact repo and somebody in-house changes it, whether it's them actually doing it or somebody using their stolen credentials, that can happen here. And you can choose the poor model to actually grab from there and deploy to production. So 2 opportunities there. And then I'm going to skip over that one. I was going to, but let me highlight it briefly. In the lower left corner is the whole class of attacks about data poisoning. So here you run into issues if you don't have really good config management on data sets. And that is a hard problem because in some cases data sets are billions of records. How config managing data in that kind of size is a tough problem, and data scientists are not used to doing that. Software engineers are. We're used to get checkout, make my change, create a branch, and push it for a pull request, right? That's like in our nature where we're used to doing that kind of stuff. Data scientists are not. They're used to directly interacting with the data, cleaning it up, and then using that for training a model and testing a model. So reworking and working closely with our data scientists to help them understand more GitOps kind of stuff and workflows and config management of data sources is super important to help head off attacks that are in this category. We really should be working from immutable data sources with known changes to a next kind of state of that data source to the next state if we're using in-house data and training our own models. All right, so mitigations, and then we'll wrap. It comes as no surprise that when we're talking about third-party model storage like Hugging Face, we really do have a responsibility as companies to review all of their policies and practices from a security perspective. And it's a risk decision. Are we comfortable with how Hugging Face does things? Do we need to add our own layer of protection in-house, in addition to what they do and so forth in order to manage the risk? Remember when I talked about earlier in the talk that developers often in a framework will just add a model name in source code and never go to Hugging Face directly. And then that framework goes to Hugging Face to pull down the model. So in this case, let's say Hugging Face is approved. It actually is worthwhile to always proxy these kinds of software downloads, framework downloads, model downloads through some artifact repo. There are a couple on the market. You all know the names. I don't want to promote a particular one, but I can tell you examples if you're interested. But the point is, allowing these kind of direct downloads, you can train somebody all you want. If they don't know to go look at the UI, they're not going to get these warnings, and nothing's going to pop up in the IDE. One of the benefits of using those third-party artifact repos is some of them actually have threat intelligence feeds that plug into them, and they can actually highlight models that they know, like this particular version has embedded malware. And you can flag it right there so that it doesn't get downloaded and loaded on somebody's machine. Okay, second, private repos. So if you've got your own in-house private repo for these things, the talk I gave last year talked about how important it is to think of every possible CI/CD bypass mechanism and enforce that only the approved pipeline writes that model into that artifact repo and can't change it once it's been written in there, at least from a version standpoint, right? Very, very important. There's so many backdoors into artifact systems. And the second is, even if the artifact system says that they guarantee, like they'll flag something if it gets changed in storage, it really is worthwhile to add at least an integrity check outside that artifact repo, right? Because if someone can change stuff in the repo, they can change the checksum too. Or add digital signing, even if it's a detached signature, so that you know the model is what you expected when you pull it out later. Finally, I wanted to talk about model source. it is possible to write your own regex expressions if you're using something like semgrep, where you can write your own rules to look for pickle. I mean, it is not difficult to look for pickle, unpickle, to look for JSON, marshal, unmarshal, and so forth. These very unsafe methods. I highlighted a couple others for HDF5 that you could search for as well. And you can even do that offline. That doesn't have to happen in the pipeline. Better to happen in the pipeline to prevent it getting in there, but at least you would detect it at some point in the source. If you want to, perfect your rules offline by looking at the code source itself. And file IO, I think, was the other example I gave earlier. All right, so I hope, I know I have hours and hours and hours studying this class of attack. I hope that this really distilled kind of talk was not only useful to you, but also helpful to you going forward in terms of thinking about these types of attacks. And please remember, if you forget nothing else, this whole chain, valuable offer, needs to be accessible, contain a hidden exploit, and have a low trigger threshold. That in my mind helps me as soon as I see accessibility, I see some storage of something of value, immediately, intuitively, I think, what happens if that changes? And I don't get out what I put in. And it has me immediately going there. So that's a key one in that chain. And then the low trigger threshold, no checks or few actions that somebody has to take for an attack like that to occur. 10,000 hours is supposed to be what it takes to master any particular skill. I would encourage you, spend hours thinking about specific classes of attacks in order to get them intuitive in your mind so that you don't have to think about it, they just come automatically. And who knows, with generative AI, maybe we can teach artificial intelligence systems to do the same thing for us to help speed up our work. All right, that's all I have for the talk, and I'm open to Q&A. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So when you download the model and you have it on the researcher's laptop, or they're doing anything with it, if that model is compromised and it starts doing malicious behaviors like you were describing, is it the same kind of indicators that you would see with any compromised system, or are there some key indicators of compromise with AI models that you've observed?
The indicators I'm aware of are very similar to Trojanized software. Yeah, the same kind of like reverse shell or an initial dropper, initial access kind of stuff. So you're going to see an outbound beacon, right to a public location of the attacker's choice that they monitor. If you're running EDR on the endpoints, you will see EDR alert, right? So hopefully that stops it right there at the dev machine and they don't have a lot of other creds that could have been hit. But yeah, there are a number of models that were compromised as proofs of concept, and those they don't do anything. So they're benign. They just say like, you've been pwned, but it doesn't do anything, right? They were more researchers not trying to harm people. Those have been cleaned up, but it may still be possible, and there you're not going to really see any indicators. Yeah.
You mentioned a few times that like plug and place only keeps the warnings and blue right?
Yeah.
But they have a very big ecosystem of plugins and IDs and in the terminal itself. What's stopping them from the warnings?
So the question was about, does Hugging Face plugins to the IDE, do those actually highlight the warnings?
And in the terminal as well, like when you import plugin things, so what's stopping them from putting a warning, like just a log warning?
I mean, it would be wonderful if there are plugins that highlight those warnings right to the developer. I am not aware of them, but I also don't know everything, right? So there very well may be. My experience firsthand has been within a model, I just plugged in, within a framework, I just changed the model name to one that I knew were other options because of the documentation. No warnings. Yeah, very good question. I think in that vein, let me add an opinion here. the more that we can put right in front of developers as warnings, the better, right? Because it'll head off mistakes right then before anything gets checked in or pushed. Yes, in the back.
Are there any tools to scan the models so you would know that something was compromised or not?
Yeah, there are. I in my study, I ran across one that's a paid service. They say that they go layer by layer through the model and actually find way more than pickling. That's a paid one. They were probably open source. I didn't get that far, just because I was trying to characterize the risk within our company. But yeah, are you aware of any?
No, I'm aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, hidden layer. You might go check them out. They are very prolific on the kind of attacks that can happen with artificial intelligence models. They may have something or have pointers to it. There are also some really good code examples if you just want to play with this yourself and see if you can get one of these pop-up messages that says you've been pwned. Mark, yeah.
I have one last comment. Have you considered the reverse Trojan use case?
Explain to me the reverse Trojan use case. This is where you harm the attacker?
Yeah, I'm sure most people have heard that somebody's always coming to your porch, stealing your package.
Oh, and so when somebody steals your package, you have an Easter egg in it?
You put animals' feces in there,
Okay.
and they get surprised.
Oh my word. Yeah, that's probably a whole other slide, right? Of what are the characteristics? Watering hole, common attack.
By the way, very, very good talk. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Who else? Yeah?
So you mentioned risk, right? And being, having that risk awareness, risk appetite, how much risk they're willing to take on. Can you kind of, deep dive into that? Like, what have you seen from a risk perspective for teams to make those calls, depending on, I know we talked about your question, EDR as an example, as a mitigating control.
Yeah.
But anything else regarding the risk matrix? Just overall, leadership's going to want to know, how much risk are we willing to take on by, having, Huffing Face, as, without no overlay, of defenses, for example. So
Yeah.
just if you can debug.
Yeah, to summarize for the recording, the question was, from a risk perspective, how do I think about characterizing it? What are some mitigating controls, right, in order to communicate to execs that it's okay or maybe not okay to use Hugging Face or others? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Boy, that is a big question. I can't answer it for your company. The kinds of things that I think through are, so how effective, not just do they run this pickling scan, but how effective is that at catching this class of attacks? As I pointed out, there are other ways to do unsafe deserialization. So in my mind, they're not going far enough right now to protect all of us from an ecosystem perspective, which would argue for compensating controls, right? What else can I add? That's why I like the proxy kind of approach where outbound direct connections to Hugging Face aren't even allowed from dev laptops, right? They have to go through our artifact kind of repository where we can control which internet registries are okay to use, possibly this one, but add extra layers of defense like threat intelligence, for specific versions of packages and so forth. And then there's other monitoring kind of stuff. I mean, to go back to the incident response kind of case, right? Where are these attempts coming from? Is it in the developer workflow that we're seeing these outbound attempts to Hugging Face? Are we having these come out in production, which means we're not catching something earlier? There are just a lot of scenarios to think through because of how many places that code could execute during the pipeline. At the end of the day, though, it's risk, right? And all of our companies are in business to do business, not to have zero risk. So I would characterize it as, this seems like something we have to do, and let's find a way to reduce as many of the attack vectors you know, as possible, as well as have ways to detect when things go wrong. There's a lot to talk about on that one, man. It's not an easy answer. But I do know from talking with data scientists, Hugging Face is the place to go. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of vertical head nods. It really is the place. So to say no to that, things would have to be pretty bad there. It's kind of like saying no to GitHub, right? Like things would have to be pretty bad there for us to say, absolutely not. We'd have to have a strong leg to stand on. That's my thoughts. You ask a risk question and you get like a tome.
I'm the GRC guy here, so.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, increasingly, that's where I spend my time too. What else? I see some conversations. Anyone else have questions? Otherwise, I can cut you loose a little bit early to go get ready for the raffle. Y'all good? All right, well, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your time.